Hey, Miguel Dorati for the CRP, and we're going to head off into a slightly new subject and direction here at the Cage Rage podcast, and I'm going to do a book review. Many of the folks here around the Cage Rage podcast, we've been talking about potentially expanding into the book review area and some of the books that we may have read just for the fun of it, and I wanted to start with a powerful book, so I'm going to actually start with the set that is a three-book set called The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The book was first published in 1973. It's an incredible story, and it basically is a man that spent years in the Russian Gulag system, their jails, and documented the whole jail system under communism. And once the books were published in 1973, they became a window into really how extensive that system was. And, that's where the idea that, it ground up millions of people, that millions of people died under Stalin. And, we'll cover that here, mainly under Stalin. That number, ranges from, but they're all extreme numbers, 15 million, 30 million, whatever. This is one of the foremost documents we have over how detailed things got. So I found it to be a strong and powerful book. In 1973, when it was published, it was kind of published in a hurry. The author had, received some notoriety. He'd already been an author, and during a brief moment of cooling under Khrushchev, he had published A Day in the Life, and basically, it's a little 80-page book that talks about one person who's in jail and what it is his day. There's chapter or paragraphs on trying to hide a piece of bread and things like that. But that was published in Russia under communism, under Khrushchev, while there was a cooling down. And the Russians read it, and many people were came forward. And he'd already been documenting and collecting stories. And, in a very suspicious world, in the Soviet Union, you're in a situation where you're kind of looking for other people who were in the camps and share stories and things like that. And that is what the Gulag Archipelago is. It's a documentation of the camps and the stories that Solzhenitsyn collected, in secret. The book itself was never completed in one spot where he was writing it, like a normal writer. He had pieces hidden with certain people and other pieces hidden with other people. And at some point, the Russian government seized it, and when they had it is when he said, okay, I'm going to have to go and publish it, and it was published in 1973. So after that, he went into exile. He was exiled. It's a move that actually goes back to the czars in Russia. They exiled their political opponents, so he was exiled to the States, lived here for 20 years, and went back in 1990, in the early 90s, back to Russia, so his life story is very interesting. So we're going to get into the books and some of the details here. I'm going to review the first two chapters. It's very heavy. I was, trying to figure out how to review all the books. I've read them, in the 90s. As a young man, I started to reread them, and that's where the idea of this podcast came about. And the bottom line with it is that, I'm going to do a couple of chapters at a time because I think it's, profound. And I think it's heavy enough that I'd like to do it that way. Anything else might not give it justice. So I'd appreciate like and subscribe, and we'll keep track of this and deliver a review of a couple chapters here on a weekly basis here. Over the next couple of months, we'll complete a pretty detailed review of the Gulag Archipelago. The book starts off with the first chapter called Arrest, and it details a little bit of the arrest process and what he put together, from stories here and there. Of other people's arrests. It does not detail his arrest. I will detail Alexander Solzhenitsyn's arrest right now before we get into the chapter. And he specifically says, I'm not going to get into mine, but he was kind of privileged, he says, in other writings and other places, to know why he was arrested. And when, he was a tank, artillery commander, where he had an artillery gun and led a group. And he had just won some awards and certifications and things for pinpointing a couple of German batteries and taking them out. And so he's a couple of weeks from being a decorated soldier, and he gets called into his battalion commander's office and is arrested on the spot by goons from Moscow, basically. And the bottom line is in all of this, you can't ask, hey, why am I being arrested? No one's going to answer you and stuff. But in the conversation, the commander asked him, he said, you have a friend in the northern Ukrainian front? And he knew right away that he's being arrested for letters he was exchanging with his friend. Now, in those letters, he was, questioning the strategy of the leaders and stuff. And other details on the letters that are on the internet, in reference to Stalin himself, he used a word called balabos, which comes from Yiddish, master of the house, and also kozyain, which is the boss, So he was using sarcasm and stuff, but as Westerners, we can criticize our leaders like that. Hey, what's the boss think he's doing here? We're grinding up soldiers and against Germany and dying needlessly. Whatever the criticism was, the sarcasm towards the boss, this got him arrested. That got him 10 years. So the first part is he was lucky to know why he was arrested from the very beginning. So he knew that this would be Article 5810. We'll hear more about that in the next subject, which is basically for the politicals. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970, still living in Russia. And he was afraid to go to Stockholm to collect the prize because he was afraid that they weren't going to let him back in Russia. And then, by a few years later, they would exile him and tell him, go away, we don't want you here anymore. I mentioned that because I think, and you look at him going back to Russia in the 90s and stuff like that. I think, we have to distinguish between what USSR is and what Russians are. There's it's very different. What died was the USSR, not Russia. And he was a very proud Russian and obviously not very proud of what, was accomplished by the USSR kind of stuff. At any rate, so those are the details of the arrest. He gets into some of the other arrests and some of the other things. They usually came in the night. They usually, black cars in the night. And they usually separated you. Now, there are some details that come up over, his arrest that are just flabbergasting. So he was arrested on the German front by, a group, 3 guys from the NKVD, the Cheka, whatever you want to call the organs. All those are used to reference what, became the KGB and then later on, I think, again, the NKVD. These were all, active. The 3 goons from Moscow came and arrested him on the German front and had to bring him back. And he describes them as ignorant, them as goonish type guys. And, he had to help them read the map to get to Moscow and actually get himself to the very gates of the Lubyanka, you know what I mean? And these guys were not capable of doing just simple things like that. And the flabbergasting thing, the thing he recognizes in retrospect, I think this is a very important and powerful insight. He said, why was there no resistance? How did they break you down that there was no resistance? And at some point, he was in Poland on his way back from Germany in a town. Why didn't he scream, I'm being arrested for no reason? Help me, notify the public. There was no outrage. There was no resistance at all. People like lambs allowed themselves to be let in. And when he came to the West, he felt that, the American system obviously didn't have that type of caveat with the Gulag system and stuff. But he did feel that the lambs part did apply to Americans. I think that's something that people should, I think take as a warning. I don't know, but are you willing to die for your ideals? And that's what it was. People were not willing to die. And we'll close the arrest chapters because that was the point of the terror that was going on. Is that when you were subject to that, all the rumors or the atmosphere that was there is. Resistance, you would get shot on the spot, So you would go through the arrest process thinking at the end, especially if you were innocent, thinking at the end, oh, I'll get free, I'll get free of this. He details the arrest of a woman who was very confident. They were going through her underwear and her private things and all kinds of stuff. And she said, they're not going to find anything, keep looking until one of the guys grabbed her diary. And that, it describes in the book that was things that she would never tell her mother But who knows, what got her arrested in there, But they read her private diary, and maybe it was just that she resisted or freaked out and got arrested. And then, whatever they wanted to apply to the diary, they could slap a sentence on her. So it was definitely an atmosphere there where the rules, let's get into chapter 2. The chapter 2 is called The History of Our Sewage Disposal System. Assuming, again, the image of the archipelago is of islands across Russia where they are jailed. The sewage disposal system, use a little different twist on that same thing. Think of all the tubing and pipes and things that go into sewage disposal and how it distributes and comes from every house to central points and things like that. So I think that is, what he's heading into with that description there. So how do you get into this thing? The history of it. The bottom line is it's hard because in 1917 you had the Tsar in charge, and the Tsar was known as being repressive. So all of what was, the NKVD or the KGB and the stuff like that was there and there to be copied by the Russian communists. When the communists took over, it was very violent, and they killed the Tsars openly and his family openly and things. And the bottom line is that Lenin, issuing directives was not going to, limit himself. We're going to be kinder than the Tsars were. They actually deliberately, I think, made a point of being, more cruel and more repressive than the Tsars. So what happened there is there was going to be arrests and things that were based on the revolution and starting from the revolution. One of the ideas he puts forth in the book is that, once you get to 1937, and that's the year of a massive arrest of Communist Party members that Stalin had. And 37 is the year everyone thinks about when they think about the Stalin repressions and things. But he says, they go back before Stalin as these organs were built. By the time you get to 1937, something that was so powerful in order to arrest so many people and take so many people into the system there, you have to think the system had gotten a lot of exercise, right? So you go back to the revolution, that's the concept of it, Lenin would put out a directive that, and I'm paraphrasing from the book, but documented directive that he would say, let's, malingerers, drunkards, people capable of causing chaos in the streets, let's have no mercy on these people, and so many may have been shot on the spot, many were arrested and things like that. And then not to mention the opposition, and then you get into what they did with the Trotskyites, the Trotsky followers, by 1937, if you had any, history and had been with the revolution since the very beginning, and you had followed Trotsky even just a little bit or written a good word about him at some point, you were subject to be arrested. So it transferred smoothly from the revolution and then to when Stalin took over, it became a state of repression there. Once you get into the history of the disposal system, there was a cooling under Khrushchev, where Khrushchev realized that Stalin and his regime had probably gone too much. He was trying to make reparations. Thus, we got, for example, the publication of A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and after that, it picked up again, and he actually ends either a prologue or one of those that's still active today, and it may still be active in some way, in Russia. And yes, now in 2019. So it's one of those things that you have to look at there. So, and what gets you into the archipelago? We talked about the arrest method, but what would happen to someone that's shot on the spot? Do you even count them? This is where he explains that the volume and the numbers just become mixed up. He tells one very interesting story of, the organs are sent to arrest a military guy. I want to say a colonel, but I may be wrong on that, but a military officer for whatever charge, anti-Soviet behavior or whatever. And so, he's on the list. He's going to go into the jails, and if he resists, he's going to get shot there and stuff like that, And then we're going to go make their arrest no matter what. Now, they weren't at the point where they were arresting families there, so his wife would have been freed the next day, except for she resisted, tried to hide the guy. So she got shot on the spot. Now, she wasn't on any list to be arrested that day. She got shot on the spot. She never got to jail or was never in any building or anything like that. How do you account for bodies like that, you know? And, you know, with these are the stories he says are stories told to him by other inmates and things like that. So they're documented stories. He's not making up, you know, when you get that level of detail, you know it's a story. And I think he credits actually exactly 256 other inmates, for lack of a better word, Zex, you know, for contributing stories and things. I think it's a very powerful intro to the book. He says, "I dedicate this to all those who did not live to tell it, and may they please forgive me for not having seen it all, nor remembered it all, for not having divined all of it." So he knows it's the tip of the iceberg, right? But he could collected stories for all he could to put this all together. And again, so now accounting for now, once you get into the jail, and there, now we're going to talk about the waves. What would get you in one of these waves? You know, so we talked a little bit about Trotskyites. So when they arrested certain members of the Communist Party, they would examine, you know, maybe their writings or things, and found a little Trotsky in the history. Those guys would have to go. You know, there's a lot about the malingering and the idea that, you know, here's a situation where, you know, the farmers and everybody, you know, the railroad workers and everybody was accused of, you know, anti-Soviet behavior, you know, actually sabotaging their work. You know, one railroad worker was arrested for sabotage because he was overloading trains with material, and, you know, making them actually be weighed down. And he was, you know, ignorantly told, accused of trying to wear down the Russian train system, you know, you know, and cause more maintenance on it. Sabotage. And the guy did 10 years for this main charge. You know, later on, when there had to be more shipping during the war, other guys won award for exactly the same things, overcharging, you know, the overloading the train system. So it was just a bizarre world where you could be arrested there. There was also very much an ethnic component. And that came also from the revolution, because the revolution comes, you know, the white Russians and stuff. But in the early part of the revolution, the resistances, you know, came from the other nations, you know, the obviously Uzbeks, Kazakhs, and things like that, you know, were independent there. But you have, you know, Belarusians and Ukrainians and, you know, other nations from up north that are very similar to Russia, but also, you know, had their own, you know, personalities and their own identities and stuff. And so the first, you know, resistance units were ethnic based, and a lot of that had to be cleansed. You know, you can't have an identity that wasn't Soviet and Russian after the revolution was there. So it started with that, and then, you know, under Stalin, that turned into, you know, taking wholesale peoples and moving them, you know, to the forest, to the Siberia, you know, and those waves got stronger and stronger. But that there was always that ethnic component. Religion was also poo-pooed, you know. Now in a free Russia, you see the Orthodox Church is a powerful institution, and that there are Russians, common, you know, people, Russians that have a religious fervor and a belief. You know, they called them true believers. They probably still call them true believers, and many of them, you know, have set up communes and things like that. But under Stalin, anybody who believed like that was suspect, and the true believers went in waves, and so did the priests, and so did the nuns and the monks and things like that. At some point, everybody was subject to be arrested. During the war, how about Russians that were prisoners of war? How could you be okay coming back from over there? You know, how can you not be a spy? So the suspicion and the suspects of everybody and the waves there, you know, were constantly happening. The 1937 wave was huge because what Stalin did is he betrayed his own power core. His main supporters and stuff he took down, and it was because of the suspicion. That's one of the things that make him, you know, the madman kind of thing that you get when you look back, you know, 70 years from now, and just at a high level, you know, oh, he killed millions. He was, you know, a cunning madman and that sort of stuff. And one of the things that gives him that reputation is he killed and put into camps his entire inner circle, and the Communist Party was just in upheaval. So the installation and safety you had of being a communist was just torn apart in the 36, 37 era by Stalin deliberately. And a whole new power group arose after that. You know, they had to be more fervor. I'll tell you a fantastic story of an arrest of somebody that got in here. In closing, as we get into the end of the review of the first two chapters, we're looking at what the jail system was, how profound it was, and how deep it was in the two chapters, arrest, and then the history of the sewage disposal system. So we're in a situation where the NKVD was everywhere. The idea that, you know, you could save yourself by turning in somebody was very prevalent and active. So there was definitely an atmosphere of distrust. So they had a very well-placed and high-placed communist leader doing a speech and praising Stalin, and this was the goal of the speech. And it ends and the applause starts, and everybody's applauding, including the man giving the speech. And it turns into a situation where the suspicion in the room becomes the applause starts to extend itself 3, 4, 5 minutes. And now nobody wants to stop applauding. Nobody wants to be the first to applaud, you know, to stop applauding, you know. And the book documents that the applause actually extended itself into the 11-minute mark before the delivery of the speech. The chairman actually stopped applauding, sat down, and everybody else followed him. Now, who more naturally to stop, you know, that kind of madness than the leader and stuff? And that would be the normal way to do it. After 11 minutes, perhaps you'd be content that, you know, Stalin had been, you know, sufficiently, you know, applauded. You know what I mean? And very shortly afterwards, the leader, the delivery guy of the speech, arrested. And whatever the charge was, anti-Soviet behavior, wasn't important. What was important was the insight of the arresting officer, who whispered in his ear during his arrest, never be the first to stop applauding. So, at any rate, there are many things like that. The guy, I find him to be an excellent writer. In my degree is in literature, and my minor in college was in Russian literature in particular. So I've read a lot of Dostoevsky and Gorky and et cetera, many of the Russians. And I find Solzhenitsyn to be absolutely powerful and fascinating. I'm going to go ahead and continue the review here next week with the next couple of chapters here. We've documented and talked about here the first two chapters of the Gulag Archipelago, and his aim here is to get people used to the idea of how vast the system was. First, with the arrests and the feeling that they could come at any time, and with the examples of how frivolous the reasons were for arrest, and then how widespread the system was, and how long, you know, how its history goes into the revolution, and actually before the revolution, from the czars having a very much a reputation as being repressive, and how when the revolution came, the revolution thought that they needed to step that up, and that was the main attitude that got them to, you know, the repression of Stalin. At any rate, I'm Miguel Durrani for the CRP. This is the first of our book reviews. I want to choose a powerful subject. I think it's relevant for today, as Russia's always in the news, and I think this book helped me get into insight, a lot of insights on Russians and the way a lot of common Russians think. I think Solzhenitsyn was at the, you know, core a very Russian person and a very insightful person, and it's a powerful book. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you can like and subscribe. You can check out our other material, which is MMA related. We're also here at the CRP interested in a lot of social issues, a lot of concentration on stem cells. You want to check out Chadilak and Soda Pop's speech show, where one of our CRP founders here is going through the process of stem cell treatments for his son who had a traumatic brain injury. So a lot of subjects here at the CRP. The book reviews are just something new, and I hope you enjoy it. I am Miguel Durrani. Thank you very much.